What's up, BookTube? It's Jimmy, and today we're going to do my July reading wrap-up. I had a really good reading month in the month of July. I read a total of, let's see if I can pull them up without dropping them, 8 books, which is a lot more than I normally read. However, a lot of these were shorter or fast-paced reads, so it didn't really feel like a whole lot. But I've been away from BookTube for like maybe 2 weeks. Yikes. About a week and a half ago, I went to a convention in Washington, D.C. called Otakon, which I've been going to since 2011, but this was the 30th anniversary this year. But it's a convention celebrating Japanese animation, manga, and sort of that intersection of nerd and Asian culture in general. I took some video. The video is extremely boring, so I apologize for that. I still find it kind of weird to talk to a camera in my own room, let alone talking to a camera outside of my room. So I didn't get great video footage. I didn't do any vlogs, stuff like that. I did get some time to read there, which, you know, you always got to fit in time to read on your trips. We're going to get into the books that I read. I've read some fantastic books, some really amazing books that I'm super glad I read. I also read some books that were a little less than amazing. And for fun, I'm going to start with my least favorite books of the month, and then we'll go up to my favorite reads. It was not a difficult choice to determine my least favorite read in the month of July, and that was Ernest Cline's 2011 novel, Ready Player One. I actually disliked this book enough that I don't really want to talk about it, but I will anyway, because, you know, I'm here. This takes place in a near future where a large amount of humanity spends its time in a digital world called the Oasis, which is sort of a combination of Facebook's metaverse with World of Warcraft, like an RPG. The Oasis was created by this man named Holiday, who can only be described as a massive frickin' nerd. Holiday cares about 80s pop culture nostalgia, 80s arcade games, 80s computer games, and almost nothing else. And upon his death, his avatar in the game announces that there is hidden inside the Oasis a massive treasure hunt for a fabulous prize. That fabulous prize is the control of the Oasis. And this sets off all sorts of people trying to go on this scavenger hunt, as well as corporations going on the scavenger hunt. And this book follows a young man named Wade, who spends all his time in the Oasis, and he wants to find the treasure that will give him control of the Oasis and give him all the fabulous riches of it. The main problem with this book is that Cline is really unable to describe anything without resorting to comparing it to something from 80s nostalgic. So everything is compared to something from an 80s video game, an 80s movie, an 80s song, and our hero, Wade, only cares about these things as well. He spends all his time watching movies like Back to the Future and playing Robotron 2084 and playing Joust, and he doesn't care about anything else besides this. And he's also pretty obnoxious. He's kind of annoying. He's a know-it-all. And I got the sense that Cline liked this character a lot and thought he was a heroic, and I really did not enjoy the voice of this. A lot of fans of this book have great things to say about the world building in it, but I just didn't see that. One of the things that I find very strange is this book is supposed to take place in a near future where there was a huge energy crisis that completely shut down a lot of economies. Despite that, over half the world's population has all this high-tech equipment and spends all their time in this massive computer network that clearly would take a massive amount of energy and technology to keep running smoothly. Doesn't make any sense to me. There's also a moment in this book where our hero, Wade, takes a bus trip to another city, and he's going across the country, basically. Cline is really happy to describe things that happen in the Oasis, and of course he describes them as in the terms of 80s movies or Dungeons and Dragons or in the terms of a video game. But when our character is taking a bus trip across the United States, whole cities are given a single sentence that says every city looked... Actually, let me read it for you. I was curious to see what the rest of the country looked like, but the view was perpetually bleak, and each decaying, overcrowded city we rolled through looked just like the last. That's the entire amount of description that Cline gives the entire outside world in this whole darn book. It's like he has almost no care for the outside world whatsoever. So when the book ends on a sort of syrupy note that says, oh, maybe we should spend some more time in the outside world and stop spending all this time in the virtual world, it felt completely fake. I thought it was a pretty lousy book. But at the same time, it's not a bad book if you just want to sit around and read something mindless on a couple hot summer days, which is exactly how I read it. And I think that's the way Cline kind of meant to read it. You turn your brain off and you read it. I would argue, though, there's a lot of other books you could turn your brain off and have a lot better time with. But that was Ready Player One. Didn't like this. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're a fiend for 80s nostalgia and you can't get enough of that, you know, be my guest. Now, the next book that I read in July, well, not the next book that I read in July, but my second least favorite book of the month was She Walks in Darkness by the American writer Evangeline Walton. I was actually kind of disappointed with this one. I read Evangeline Walton is an American writer known for some fantasy books and some horror and suspense books. I read last year, I think her most famous work, which is the her most famous work, which is the Mabinogion Quartet, or Tetralogy, which is a retelling of like the Welsh national epic, the Mabinogion, in novel form. I thought they were amazing books. I thought they were beautifully written, filled with really strange magic, occasionally brutal violence, lots of tragedy, and lots of melancholy. I thought they were amazing. I had a great time reading them. They were an absolute highlight of my reading year last year. I saw this at a store, and I was like, you know what? I want to read some more from this writer. And this was published posthumously. It was originally written in the 60s. Couldn't get a publisher, and after her death, it was, I think this was released in 2013. This is sort of a gothic suspense novel. It moves extremely quickly. So we have a young housewife who's vacationing with her husband in Italy, in Tuscany, and they're staying at the villa of a villa that once belonged to a prince who's now disgraced. They're staying at this villa, and Barbara, who is our housewife, and our narrator, and our protagonist, she sees a dead body. She finds a dead body. And that kicks off a whole series of misfortunes and lots of twists and turnings. There's a dark, sexy Italian stranger. There's a mad prince. There's ancient ruins, ancient goddesses. But it all moved a little too quickly for my taste and wrapped up a little too nicely for my taste. A good example of how this book moved too quickly for me and didn't really let things sink in is at one point in this book, Barbara and the sexy Italian stranger that she's with find a notebook from a man who was seemingly imprisoned in this villa for a time. And Barbara reads small excerpts from this notebook, and they're actually quite atmospheric. This is a pretty atmospheric book at times, so I have to give it credit there. We get these short excerpts, and then all of a sudden Barbara just summarizes the events of the notebook, summarizes it for a couple paragraphs, and then we get another excerpt. Whereas I was sort of hoping, if anyone remembers Dracula, the great diary of Jonathan Harker when he's in Dracula's castle, that first 90 pages of that book is filled with so much dread and building terror. I love that. And I was sort of hoping for a moment like this, but it seemed like Walton really just wanted to move the plot along. And I think that was sort of my problem with this book. The plot moved along just a little too quickly. I will say, though, there were some nice nods to, I thought, Lovecraft, to Poe. So there's some really nice gothic horror nods in here. But this maybe this isn't the book's problem. It's more sort of a me problem. I don't read a whole lot of thrillers or suspenseful novels. But this quite didn't click for me, which was a disappointment. Because like I said, the other 4 books I've read from this writer were absolutely fantastic. And that's the oh my goodness, it's a real mouthful to say. The Mabinogion Tetralogy. Really great books. Totally check those out if you see them at a store. Now, next book that we have on my list was Dorsai by Gordon Dickson. And this book is a collection of 3 novels. I've only read one of those 3 novels, and that novel was Dorsai. I believe Dorsai was first published in 1959. Yeah, it was first published in 1959, so it's a pretty older work of science fiction. But this takes place in a future. This is a military science fiction book, and it takes place in a future where humanity has colonized different worlds, and the humans on those worlds have sort of specialized themselves into different areas of concern. So you have one group of humanity that's sort of specialized into science, another that's sort of specialized into trade and being merchants, and then you have the Dorsai, who have specialized into military skills and military training. And they are basically bred and taught and cultured all in a military society. And they act as mercenaries on a contract basis for all the humans of the other worlds. So it's an interesting vision of like a future humanity. And this follows the career of a young Dorsai man named Donald Graham. Donald Graham is a Dorsai man, so he's very well versed in combat and in the military, but he also has a deeper side, a side that people around him think he's a little strange. And we follow his meteoric career, going from one military success to another. And eventually he finds himself embroiled in some political shenanigans. This is a fast-paced book. It's actually really exciting. There's some great battle scenes. There's a vision of space combat that really gives you a sense of the possible brutality and the dire nature of interstellar combat. It was really well done, that scene. I didn't quite love the characters in this book. It moves, like I said, fairly quickly, which is good. It's an action science fiction book. But the characters are a little flat. There's a romance in here between Donnell and a woman from another world, and it's frankly really boring. And Donald is really the only character in here that I think gets a whole lot of treatment. Other than that, though, it is a really interesting book. I'm looking forward to reading more from this particular series. I've heard some of them are pretty bad, and some of them are really, really good. I've heard this is one of the middle ones, but it was the first published book in this series, which I believe is called the Child Cycle, or Chilled Cycle. I'm not quite sure. I also have a sense, I haven't read Dune, I've only seen the movies, but I have a sense that this may have been a little bit of an inspiration to Dune. There's some thoughts about humanity ascending, and humanity ascending from a sort of lower being to a higher, more elevated being that has unique powers that most humans don't have. And that brings up, I guess, my last complaint about this book. Donald Graham, and this is not a spoiler. You can tell from the start when you're reading it. He is so supernaturally competent. He has such a keen intuition that you never once really feel he's in real danger throughout this book. So it does lack a little bit of suspense. That is, I think, a real problem in it. But despite that, there's a lot of interesting ideas in here, and it's exciting. It's a very good book. I enjoyed it. The next book I have for the month is yet another military science fiction book, but it is the last science fiction book I read, and that is Joe Haldeman's 1974 novel, The Forever War. Now, I believe Joe Haldeman fought in the Vietnam War, and this was sort of a reckoning with and sort of a transmutation of that experience into a novel form, and it's really great, really well done. This starts off in the distant future, 1997, where humanity has discovered the secret to faster-than-light travel, and they've encountered a mysterious alien race that they call the Taurans. And upon encountering them, they decide to declare war on them. And so what we're seeing is all of humanity pouring their resources, their scientific, their industrial, and yes, their human resources into this war with the Taurans. And we're seeing this conflict through the perspective of a foot soldier, a young man who was, when he was on Earth, he was a gifted and talented young man, and he is drafted into this conflict, and he's used as a piece of meat in the war machine. There's a lot of really chewy and interesting science fiction ideas in here. Lots of explorations on what would combat be like in deep space. What would it be like to set up a combat base on a little frozen exoplanet floating around millions of light years from Earth? About the use of drones or computers to target and to fight. idea is that, in our millennium, we're very used to the idea of computers and drones doing warfare for us. But reading this from a book from the 70s, I thought that was really fantastic. I thought it was very, very ahead of its time. This book also uses one of my favorite science fiction tropes, and that's the time dilation. The idea of when you're traveling faster than light, you age and time passes more slowly for you, while time passes at normal speed for the folks back home. It's one of my favorite tropes. Ursula Le Guin has a great story about that. And it's used to show how when Mandela goes on his missions and he comes back to Earth, Earth changes so much that it's unrecognizable for him. And that's sort of used as a metaphor for the wartime experience. These kids basically went to Vietnam. They participated in or were subjected to atrocities, and they came home, and home was not the same for them. So there's a really great human drama in here. Mandela also has a love interest that goes throughout the decades and centuries eventually with him. It's a really, really great book. My only problem with this book, and it's not a huge problem, is maybe the ending was a little... I'm not going to even say what the ending was, but I wanted it to end a different way. It didn't end how I expected or how I thought it should end. But I did really enjoy this book. I'm not sure if I'm going to read the rest of Joe Haldeman's Forever books. I've heard very mixed things about them, but this is a great read. Totally recommend. Now, the next book I have up for the month is something completely different. This is a work of nonfiction called Longitude by Dava Sobel. This was published in 1995, and I think it was actually a fairly popular book at the time, which is a little surprising since this is a work about history and science. But it's actually a really fascinating and exciting book. I had a great time reading it. This is about the search for an accurate method of tracking longitude on sea voyages. Longitude is sort of the east-west axis on the globe. And because of the inability to keep accurate time on a ship, sailors and navigators were unable to really accurately figure out where they were on the east-west axis of the globe. And this is a massive problem for, all of the European countries that were involved in trade and exploration. And the English government actually put a massive bounty for anyone who could figure out an accurate way to track longitude. So this is about the race to discover an accurate method for tracking longitude. And it follows, for the most part, a brilliant and sort of really eccentric clockmaker named John Harrison, who attempts and succeeds at making a clock that can accurately track time on a ship. And it's a really fascinating, amazing story. And he has some you could say adversaries. This is a book about, just as it's about scientific inquiry, it's also a book about sort of bureaucratic and scientific squabbles. He's at odds with some people who they think that the way to track longitude will be using the stars. Use the stars and the moon as a map. Whereas John Harrison thinks he can make a clock that will be accurate to the seconds on a ship, on a long sea voyage. And he succeeds. This is a really fascinating, really great story. I had a fun time reading it. Dava gets into the science of it just enough so you feel like you understand it, but not so much that your eyes spin. She also has a good knack for setting up characters that make it a narrative. John Harrison is our main character. He's a watchmaker and a clockmaker. And he has an antagonist in this, Maskelyne, who is the royal astronomer. And Maskelyne sort of sabotages his efforts at times because Maskelyne believes that using the stars and the moon and the heavenly objects as a guide is going to be the best way to do this. So there's this sort of bureaucratic and scientific antagonism there. And it's a really fun read. And there's a couple parts in here that are actually beautiful. I didn't pick out the passages, but when Dava describes the beauty of the clocks that Harrison makes, particularly the beauty of his final creation, the H4, which is this really intricate sort of handheld watch that can tell time on a ship. It's great. I actually got goosebumps during some of the descriptions here. It was a really fun book. I'm glad I read it. And my reason for reading it is kind of interesting. Well, it's not kind of interesting. It's not that interesting at all. But this is not what I would normally read. But I have been on a sort of mission to read a little more nonfiction throughout the year. Most of my reading is fiction. So I'm trying to, pepper in some nonfiction. I want to read this year, or reread, Thomas Dickson's fantastic novel, Mason and Dickson, which takes place during the same exact time period. And Mason and Dickson also have a little bit of a cameo in this, as well as the other character, Masqueline. Masqueline is also an antagonist of Mason and Dickson in this book. So it's about sort of the age of reason, the age of discovery. And I thought if I was going to reread this year, I wanted to have a little more background knowledge. So this was something I picked up, and I'm really happy I sort of spread my wings and read a little differently than I normally do. Now, my next book I absolutely loved, and this was the summer book by Tove Jansson, who is a Finnish writer. She's most well known for creating the Moomin, which are comics about little magical creatures that live in a forest. I don't know a whole lot about the Moomin. I haven't read them, but I know that's her most famous creation. But I read another book from her a few years ago called Fair Play, and I thought it was fantastic. And so I wanted to read some more from her, and I loved this. This is about a young girl, I think she's 6 years old, named Sophie, and she's staying in the summer with her grandma and her father on a little island. Sophie's mother recently passed away, or recently died. And this is really a story about the relationship of Sophie with her grandma. And it's told in these beautiful and often very funny and sometimes a little dark vignettes about that relationship between the young girl and her grandma. This is a book with a lot of humor, and it's also got a lot of heart, but it never feels sentimental ever. I never read this. It never felt like a cloying or overly emotional. It never felt like a Hallmark card. The relationship between this grandmother and this young girl is very real. And the grandmother is a sort of world-weary older person. Her joints creak. She walks slowly. She gets dizzy if she stands up too quickly. And her granddaughter, Sophie, sort of accepts her for that, but treats her just like any other person. And the grandmom treats Sophie like just any other person. There's some very funny scenes in here. Sophie adopts a cat and hates it, and then adopts another cat and hates that cat, so asks for her other cat back. Funny things like that. But there's also beautiful writing about nature, and there's also really lovely illustrations. I love this one right here. Let's get another one. I thought the illustrations in this were fantastic. I loved this book. It was a great read. It didn't take very long, and it's called The Summer Book, so I had to read it in July. Really lovely book, The Summer Book. It's quite short, but it's great. Really good. Now, my next book is sort of cheating a little bit because it's only the first volume of 5 volumes for one book. But this is Xueqin's The Story of the Stone, also known as The Dream of the Red Chamber. Like I said, this is the first volume. I found this at a used store a few years ago, picked it up because it looked interesting, but I felt a lot of trepidation at starting it because it's so long and because it's quite old as well. This is considered one of the 4 great works of classical Chinese literature and has a really interesting publication history. Xueqin wrote this over the course of decades. I think he died in 1763, and this was not actually published. It was just circulated privately up until 1793 when it became widely published. And this translation is from the 1970s. But this sort of tracks a very wealthy, noble family, the Jia family, that lived during the imperial era in China. And we're sort of centered around a character named Bao Yu, Jia Bao Yu. And Jia Bao Yu is a young man who's very beautiful, and he's very exuberant about life, and it's about this whole family around him. Kind of hard to explain everything that goes on, because so much goes on. There's hundreds of characters. I felt like I was constantly flipping to the character directory in the back and to the family tree. But there's so much beauty in this, and it's almost like looking into a time machine. There's really granular detail about life during this time period, about customs, about poetry, about furniture, about the food and drink, and what school's like. I felt like I had been plucked up and dropped right into 1760 in Imperial China. It felt amazing. And the Jia family lives a life of wealth and luxury that's completely unimaginable. They have hundreds of servants, dozens of like concubines, and it's a very different world from what we think of European nobility. I read some reviews describing this in contrast to Jane Austen. Whereas you read Jane Austen, the servants really don't have any characters. They're not even acknowledged as real people by the characters in the books. Whereas in this, the family members all have relationships and friendships with the servants. Servants themselves have their own ambitions. Yeah, it's just really fascinating and wonderful. And another thing that's really great in this book is it's not just like a straight narrative of this crazy, interesting family. There's sort of small and eruptions of the supernatural in this book. Demons come and visit. We have a fairy comes in the middle of Bao Yu's dream. There's lots of poetry in here. My favorite sequence in this, I think it was chapter 17 or 16, where the family patriarch has built a absolutely amazing landscaped garden with different buildings and mountains and forests and little tiny farms inside of it. And Bao Yu and his father and some sort of scholars are walking through this amazing garden, and they're coming up with poetry to describe the garden. It's absolutely wonderful. I had such a great time reading it. It's a very slow reading book, and there's so many characters, and the culture is so different from what I'm used to, that I did have to slow down and take my time with this. But there's lots of great storylines going through this. It's certainly not like Proust, where it's a narrative-less book. There are threads and a plot line going through here, and there's lots of character relationships and dynamics. It's a lot of fun. I'm having a great time reading it. Unfortunately, I've never seen the second or third or fourth or fifth volumes anywhere at a bookstore. So I had to order the second volume from eBay. Hopefully it'll be coming in this week. I'm looking forward to reading more from this. It's a really wonderful book. And that brings me to my last book for the month, which was my favorite read. This was Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which is her first novel. And I loved it. I had such a good time reading it. This is my third... I read it on my Kobo, which I love this. It's a great e-reader. But this is my third time reading a Jane Austen novel. Last year I read Pride and Prejudice for the first time, and I liked it a lot, but I had sort of trouble getting into the time period and into Austen's voice and her storytelling style. Earlier this year I read Persuasion, which I really enjoyed, but this, I had so much fun reading it. I got so wrapped up in it, and I think now that I've gotten a sense of how Austen tells stories and a sense of the age in which she lived and wrote, I actually did, during the course of reading this, I did some reading about finances and about the culture in the Regency period of England, and that helped things click a lot more for me. But I had such a good time reading this book. This follows two sisters, basically, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, who, due to their father's death and their brother's sort of awful wife, their brother is a sort of greedy, not nasty, but he's a greedy, sort of selfish guy, and his wife's a nasty, selfish woman. And at their father's death, Marianne and Eleanor and their family are sort of left in limbo, and they are in a difficult financial situation. And we follow their falling in love, their successes and their failures in love. It's a real page turner because there's a couple love interests, and you want to know who they're going to get with. You kind of know, but you want to see how it happens. She has that knack for, you know how things are going to end, but you got to see how it ends like that. It's also a very funny book. There's lots of wry observations about life, very witty dialogue. Like I said, some of the characters are real villains. They're nasty people, and it's funny how nasty they are sometimes. It's actually really funny to read. I had a great time reading it. My favorite character in this is actually a sort of older woman, busybody matchmaker, Mrs. Jennings, who initially Eleanor and Marianne don't really like because she's vulgar and loud and nosy, but she has such a good heart and she's so funny to read. There's a great video from, I think, Katie with Books and Things does a deep dive into this Mrs. Jennings character, and it's a lot of fun to watch that video. This is a real page turner. It's a fantastic book. I couldn't put it down, and I was smiling the entire time. I was also on the edge of my seat, even though I kind of knew what was going to happen anyway. You know things are going to probably end well for them, but you got to see how it happens. I think it's sort of a shame that Jane Austen is sort of thought of as a woman's writer. I think more people should read her. I think anyone can enjoy a book like this. It's just a really, really great, fantastic book. So that's Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. If you haven't read Jane Austen, give her a shot. I would say Pride and Prejudice or this are the best places to start. And you just have to know that this is a very different time period. Social customs and mores and finances were all so different from what we're used to. And storytelling style was so different from what we're used to too. But Jane Austen does not drag. She moves you along, and it's great. Reading her is great. So this was so good that I actually picked up another Jane Austen book at a store a couple of days ago, and I plan on reading the rest of her novels. So that's Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. That's my favorite read in July, and like I said, I couldn't have been happier reading this. So if you made it to the end of this video, oh my god, it was a long one. I'm probably going to try to space out my my book thoughts, not for all at the end of the month. Maybe do bi-weekly or something, because this was a lot of books to go through in one sitting. I'll tell you right now, I'm covered in sweat. My voice is dying. I'm parched. So, but hey, that was my reading month in July. Thanks for watching this. If you got here, good for you. You watched it for too long. But thanks, and I'll see you again.